Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for having me. It is so exciting to get up and talk in front of you. Normally, I am having these conversations in the opposite way, where I am taking the expertise and collaboration that's represented in this room and talking to Congress. So it's very exciting to go the other way and talk a little bit about Congress, which, 20 minutes is certainly enough to do. No mysteries that can't be solved in that amount of time. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Corinna Turbes, and I am the Policy Director for the Data Foundation. The Data Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank here in DC that focuses on improving society through the use of data. This includes advocating for chief data officers, the statistical agencies, conducting research and analysis on ways to improve the uses of data, and working with the community to support collaboration to make sure that our data is healthy and effective. We advocate around using evidence to promote good decision-making in policy areas. And of course, we started out in the financial regulatory data. Today, I'm going to be providing a little bit of background on how the data standards get embedded into keystone data laws and the sort of unique value proposition in getting Congress involved. So most recently, I'm sure you've been talking about all day, was the Financial Data Transparency Act that was passed last year as a part of the FY 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. This amends security and banking laws to make the information reported to financial regulators electronically searchable and to further the development of regulatory technology and artificial intelligence applications. The ultimate goal is to harmonize reporting requirements, reduce the private sector's compliance burden, and enhance transparency and accountability. This was a long time coming when we started working on this bill. It was first introduced in the 114th Congress and was finally passed in the 117th. It went through a lot of iterations, a lot of name changes, a lot of different sponsors. But one thing that always happened was that it was a bipartisan bill, and that was something that was very important. We've already covered that. So like I mentioned, started in the 114, went in the 117th, but a lot of things were happening while conversations around the FDTA were happening as well. It wasn't just a singular focus. There was a lot of conversation in Congress about the value of data as we are moving to an ever more data-driven society. So the FDTA built on multiple previous laws. First and foremost, the Data Act. This is the Data Accountability and Transparency Act that mandated federal agencies adopt data standards for their spending information. There's a $4 trillion federal budget, and the Data Act helped us get insights into where that money was actually going. After the Data Act, there was also the GREAT Act, which, as a quirk of Congress, you have to come up with a great acronym. And the GREAT Act means the Grant Reporting, Efficiency, and Agreements Transparency Act. GREAT Act. And that extended similar data standard reporting to our grants that are given out from the federal government. And then, of course, in 2018, we see the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, or the Evidence Act, that further advanced data standardization across federal agencies, not just in financial data. The Evidence Act also created the Chief Data Officer at federal agencies, asked agencies to develop open data plans and inventory their data assets. It also charged the Office of Management and Budget with developing an open data standard for reporting administrative data. So we have seen a lot of change in the last decade, and we have seen Congress taking more and more interest in data standards, which is incredibly important. But one thing that is really important to notice, to know about Congress, is they are not technical experts in this. It's not their job. We have a wide variety of expertise at our financial regulators. We have our stakeholder community, and Congress has a different job to do. Congress's job is to create the policy environment that allows this expertise to flourish. So, how do we start to talk to Congress about continuing this appropriate interest in data standards? One really big challenge is making the problem relevant to them. There is a challenge of understanding why they should care about this if they're never going to get a constituent call about the taxonomies chosen for financial regulators. This is a very hard grassroots issue. But Congress does have an important oversight function. And something like data standards can help improve how Congress does its job. We just heard that the SEC has a congressionally mandated report. They are certainly not the only agency. And right now, we're actually working towards getting those mandated congressional reports as machine readable. That is another example of how we can demonstrate how data standards can help solve problems that are relevant to Congress. Another really big challenge is how we translate this technical expertise into policy expertise. These are not necessarily the same thing, though equally important. Policymaking is a team sport, and we need all of us working together. So one example of how this happened was really with the Financial Data Transparency Act. We really needed to think carefully about how we were amending the underlying statute, and that what ended up in the language of the law didn't accidentally manifest in requiring a certain standard or accidentally triggering something that we didn't want to do. And so having that meeting of the minds of how to really understand what the technical requirements are and what we're trying to achieve and how that is accurately translated into the legalese can be a very tough thing to do, and honestly can cause a lot of consternation and a lot of last minute phone calls before a vote just to make sure that we have everything on the up and up and where we want it to be. Another really important challenge of working with Congress is a sustained interest. We saw on the last panel that some of these projects can take years. They are complicated, hairy issues, and making sure that Congress that is struggling on a lot of different fronts can sustain that interest can be difficult. And so a lot of what the Data Foundation does in partnership with our allies and stakeholders is making sure that we are continually working with our congressional partners on what the appropriate asks are for them. Where should they get involved? How should they get involved? They don't necessarily want to have an opinion about every sort of technical option, but they do want to make sure that what they asked financial regulators to do is what they are doing. This becomes a very big challenge when thinking about elections. The FDTA, for example, one of our biggest champions lost her election. And so ultimately was not, it was her sort of last ditch effort and one of the last bills that she had passed, but that was going to be a bit of a challenge. She also lost her chairmanship on the Financial Services Committee, which required us to work with different offices. And all of this comes together into making sure that we can find our congressional champions. All of these things about making a problem relevant, translating this technical expertise, and sustaining interest can help us find those long-standing champions. Some Congress people get to stay around for a long time, and if they can get on your side, we can have some really great opportunities, and we can really start to develop great relationships with staff and with those offices so they can really see some of those results. So what is Congress thinking about next? Please don't quote me on any of this because who knows what will happen. But we've seen a lot of references to ESG data. This can get very complicated again because there is a policy concern coming from both sides of the aisle about what we want ESG data to do. And so in the next, I would say, session, in the next couple of months and weeks, there will be really important conversations about what do we as a society, as an economy, need ESG data to do? What problems is it trying to solve? And where are the technical solutions to help manifest that? Cryptocurrency, also, every time there is something in the news, we are going to hear Congress wanting to get involved. It is another way, another hook to make something relevant and prescient. So, and of course, everyone's favorite topic du jour, artificial intelligence and machine learning. With the release of these large language models, we have now seen an interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning from the Hill that those of us in the data community maybe have been banging the drum for a while now, but now there is a pressing interest. And so one of the fun things about working with Congress is that you never quite know when their attention is going to be grabbed. And the sort of always be prepared motto is one of the best ways to capitalize on those things. And of course, I always have to leave a few question marks there because there are so many unknowns with this. We saw a brief blip in concern over regulations with the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. That, of course, didn't really suspend a lot of things. There are new questions about privacy-enhancing technologies that are coming out of Congress and how all of those will play together. So we mentioned earlier that there is a lot of collaboration that needs to happen as people are looking to implement these data standards. But there is also a lot of collaboration that needs to happen before laws are passed. And that is a really important aspect of working with Congress, that it matters that we have different stakeholders from different sectors all working together to communicate to Congress what is important, what these problems can do. So I talked very quickly through all of this because I was a little nervous to stand out in front of all of you, but that is a little bit about how to chat with Congress. I am happy to talk a little bit more about the process with FDTA. I see a lot of my colleagues who had a lot to do with the passage of that bill in the room too. So happy to take any questions about the Data Foundation or how to work with Congress.
So don't forget your Slido. You can submit questions through Slido. And I actually have a couple of questions.
Oh, wonderful.
If that's okay. Yes. So yeah, so if you submit questions, I can ask them up here. So I just like to ask Corinna, you know, we're in a sort of a volatile state congressional wise. What do you see happening with the potential government shutdown again, and then also with the election next year? How do you see that affecting kind of the work that we're doing, and also just the FDTA implementation?
Yeah, I'll sort of take that last part first about the election. One thing that we've seen about both the Evidence Act and the FDTA especially is that they were overwhelmingly bipartisan. One thing about having a quote unquote boring issue, I don't agree with that terminology, but again, it doesn't make headlines, is that it does present a really important opportunity for Congress to get bipartisan wins. It's not going to be controversial. It's a good governance issue. And so we see a lot of sustained interest. So if we see a change in leadership in either house that might affect timing on when any bills might be given to the House, it might affect the oversight agenda of a lot of these issues, but data standards are largely a bipartisan issue. And so when thinking about elections, that is a real plug in our favor. So the shutdown.
Second one.
The maybe not, that is very hard to tell. I think the takeaway is a government shutdown always has an adverse impact on the data we all rely on. That's true for what happens with the regulators. That's true for what happens with our statistical agencies. And it would be very damaging. And I think speaks to the larger issue of how we have sustained funding for these projects. This is not something that can be done in a single fiscal year. This is something that's going to require predictable funding. And that is a way of thinking about what is an appropriate ask for Congress, and that sustained, reliable, multi-year funding, as well as perhaps some funding flexibilities to support CDOs, the FSOC agencies, and others as they work to implement the FDTA and other laws.
Okay, great. Another question, you know, we've seen some bills that, you know, from our standpoint, and of course we are a data standards organization, but have great promise, like the GREAT Act. And then when it comes to implementation, it doesn't seem to meet the letter of the law whatsoever. And so I'm just wondering, you know, what can we do as an organization to ensure that it does? And why is there so much latitude in how these things are rolled out?
Sure. I think a lot of the latitude comes from Congress not wanting to be overly prescriptive. We're talking about things that they don't necessarily have the expertise to. You know, the phrase, it takes an act of Congress, you know, has that meaning for a reason, right? So they want to make sure that they're allowing agencies the appropriate flexibility to leverage their expertise. But unfortunately, what that can mean is if an agency is strapped for cash, if an agency is strapped for resources, it can become really difficult to meet explicitly unfunded mandates. And that is not a statement on the quality of work and the dedication of our federal agencies. That's really a question of, are we asking mountains of these folks? And so I think as advocates, what we can really do is let Congress know that we care about this, that we I don't want to necessarily say united, because we don't all have to be on the same message explicitly, but to let Congress know that there are constituencies that really care about this. And so that continued support, that strategic support, can be really very helpful in making sure that we get our agencies funded and that they are able to implement when they can.
Okay, great. Corinna, thank you so much.
Yes,
We've run out of time.